Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. Today is pole position. And of course, we are going down the Second World War route. Alex has finally allowed me to bring in some World War II history. So we've gone out and found something completely outside of the box. And I'm really excited about this. But it's not just going to be me today doing hosting. I've got Tim, who runs the Kresa Siberia account. Many of you have probably come across him at one point or another. Hi, Tim.
Hi. Thanks for the invite.
Great. It's going to be you and me hosting this one. Our guest today is Anuradha Bhattacharjee. She is a former journalist, an LSE alumni, and she wrote her PhD on the second homeland, basically Polish refugees in India. I mean, I'm going to tell you this right now. I've never heard of Polish refugees in India, so I'm so excited to know so much more. Hi, Anuradha. How are you?
I'm very well. Hello, Alina, and thank you so much for having me on this show.
This is so outside of the box. I mean, when we listen and we talk about refugees that have come from the Soviet Union, Polish refugees, you usually think Israel or, for example, Africa or you know, just not India, if you know what I mean.
No, they came to India from these countries. They came to India primarily they were Polish who came out of USSR. I mean, they were evacuated by the Anders army, and they found a home in India courtesy the offer of an Indian prince. And should I get back into the history properly?
Well, let's start, I think, with a little bit of background information. So what is the situation in Europe? If you just give us a really brief summary of where we are with all of this.
The Polish people who reached India, primarily the children, the orphan children who reached India, was in 1942. So 1942 is the thick of the Second World War. The Polish government had become the Polish government in exile at London at that time. And major parts of India were largely under British rule. Now, here is one thing that I must flag. Mostly people think the entire India was under British rule, British domination at that time, which is actually not really correct. We had over 500 Indian states, princely states, that were largely independent. Of course, their military and diplomatic powers were curbed by the British, and they had sworn allegiance to the British crown. But they were Indian states, and they together had been formed into a body called the Chamber of Princes, and they regularly parleyed with the British. There were several Indian states, Hyderabad, Travancore, and amongst them, the ones which are most related to the history of Poland are Navanagar, Kolhapur, Patiala, and Baroda. And another part that's pretty okay, if anybody who is more interested in knowing about the history of the Indian states could refer to Professor Ian Copland's book, Princes of India and Game of an Empire. They had been formed into the Chamber of Princes, and there was a chancellor, and so Navanagar was pretty active in that scheme of things. So do you want me to continue how the Polish story happened, or would that be another question?
Yeah, no. Do you know what? Let's touch on actually how Poles ended up in India.
Okay, that's actually a very, very interesting story because it goes back to the First World War, or the interwar years rather, when Poland had just emerged as a nation state after 123 years. Here I'm citing Professor Norman Davies. So if I'm wrong, my apologies in advance. Because I'm no historian of the history of Poland, you know.
That's Norman Davies is the god of all Polish history. So whatever he says, let's roll with it. Let's roll with it.
It's gospel truth. So he's the one I've referred to. So he says that Poland had emerged as a nation state after 123 years. So I take it as gospel truth. And just as Poland had emerged and then the League of Nations deliberations had started, so India was being represented by the Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes, which I just mentioned a little while ago. And the Chancellor was Maharaja Ganga Singh of Bikaner and Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Navanagar. Many people would remember, those who are interested in cricket might know him. He was a very avid cricketer. Yeah, so he was known as Ranji in the UK. So Ranji used to deputize for Maharaja Ganga Singh of Bikaner pretty often, because by then, he was kind of getting on in age and health issues, etc., etc. And Ranji, because of his, cricket and, generally he was very, very almost British. He had a chateau in Switzerland. And there his neighbor down the road was Monsieur Ignacy Paderewski. Do I need to introduce him to a Polish population?
Do you know what? We're going...
Brilliant.
Tell us who he was, because not everyone's going to know. Our Polish listeners will, but we've got a lot of people that aren't Polish that are listening to the podcast, so I think it might be worthwhile you telling them who he is.
Okay. Monsieur Ignacy Paderewski, he was a very famous pianist and later on became one of the prime ministers, if I recall right, of Poland. So in Switzerland, they were very well acquainted, Ranji and Monsieur Paderewski. And Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji was the crown prince of Navanagar at that time. And so he often got to spend a lot of time with Ranji in Switzerland to learn statecraft in those years. So when he inherited the state from Ranji a couple of years later, so along with the state, he also inherited a very good social circle, which included Monsieur Paderewski. And then, we cut it here into warriors, and we get to the Second World War. And so Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji by then is the Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes. So he becomes the representative of India at the Imperial War Cabinet, etc. And there in the middle of the war, the Polish government in exile is negotiating with the British, telling them about the terrible time that the population is having in Soviet Russia. And they need help evacuating the people, the citizenry out from there. And the British are like a little reluctant, citing primarily lack of a destination as one of the chief reasons, like, how can we help? Where do we send them in these kind of wartime situations? So during these meetings, one of these meetings, I think they were together, Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji as the Chancellor of the COP and a member of the Imperial War Cabinet, and Monsieur Ignacy Paderewski. And, through the lunch, that's what the family says, that, it was during the lunch break that they had a quick word. And, in a very typical Darbari style, he just said, look, if a destination is what is needed, treat my state as yours and, send your people over. But since I have, my predecessors have signed away the diplomatic rights, you guys will have to kind of figure it out with the British. But, whatever that needs to be done, my state is yours.
I like that. I really like that whole, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine, if that makes sense.
If that makes sense. But yeah, we have a philosophy, we have a very traditional Sanskrit philosophy. It says, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It means the whole world is family. And this entire history is actually a living example of that Indian philosophy. So then once this news kind of spread within the Polish circles that, okay, we have a potential place in India, whatever, the formalities started getting done. He was asked to write a letter of invitation. So I think there was some pressure, so he just wrote a letter of invitation for 500 children first. And of course, he wrote another invitation for another 500 children later on, because there were pressures, about how much India can take, because the British were very reluctant, about what are the kind of pressure that, a large number of exiled people would put. But over here, I would actually like to make a point that there were other exiles also who were coming into India, because we have evidence of people coming from the Balkans, from Burma, from the Jewish transit coming from China, etc. Because there was the office of the principal refugee officer. Yes, Maltese. So there were all kinds of people who were coming to India. Now, I don't really know what exactly. Sorry?
No, I'm just going to say that it's fascinating, and it runs counter to what people might have assumed based on the Iranian experience. They might have assumed that it was enforced from the top down, from the British. So this is such a wonderful corrective to that. So did the British fund these camps or have any involvement in running them?
I'm actually on the contrary, very much on the contrary. I don't know about the other camps for other nationalities, but for the Polish children, charitable funds were raised in India. There was a fund set up called the Polish Children's Fund, which was set up by the Viceroy with the first contribution of rupees 50,000. And that account was held with the Imperial Bank of India. And there were many subscribers to it for whatever amounts of money that they could spare. The arrangement was that these funds would be raised in India for the upkeep of the Polish children, and the Polish government in exile had agreed to defray any shortfall between what was raised and what was actually spent in taking care of these children. But I'm very proud to, say, and as an Indian, that actually the Polish government in exile was never called upon to meet any money for this. The Indians, there is a letter. It is there reproduced in the book. The Indians contributed in excess of rupees 600,000, and this we are talking about 1942, which roughly translated to approximately 29,500 pounds sterling at that time. Yes. And in today's terms, I did some rough back of the envelope calculations using a website, authorized website. It amounts to about 1.5 million euros in real value terms in 2020.
That's absolutely incredible. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to this and thinking, wow, we really have to thank India for what they did. I mean, 1.5 million euro, even in today's standard, that's an incredible amount of money.
Well, thank you. I thank you as an Indian. We did manage to put that together. It was a fund was subscribed to by anybody who wanted to. And as an Indian, the part that I actually take great pride in reporting is that this contributions had continued through 1942 and 1943, even after there were famines in India.
Amazing.
Bengal and Madras presidencies suffered famines. The Bengal famine is very famous. It's kind of almost comparable to the famine in Ukraine. And Holodomor, I think it's called in Polish-Ukrainian literature. The famine, the studies on the famine got the Nobel Prize for Economics for Professor Amartya Sen. So, and there is, it's mentioned in the reports that yes, the contributions have been less this year, when they're talking about 1943, but they're coming in, and we might be able to, meet the requisite expenses, and they did.
I'm really interested in the types of refugees that ended up. I mean, we've spoken about children. We know that children were accepted, but were there any other refugees that India accepted?
Actually, yes. India, the port city of Karachi had become a major transit point for the Polish citizenry who were evacuated out of Russia. Because there were some pressures on the number of people present in Iran, in Tehran, etc. So they were being encouraged to move out, maybe even forced. So Karachi had become a major transit camp, and as far as the numbers are concerned, I'm quoting Keith Sword over here. There were 32,000 families, civilians. Out of the evacuation of 110,000, there was about 77,000 military personnel and around 32,000 civilians, women and children, and 15,000 orphan children. So out of these 32,000, actually 20,000 transited Karachi in various ways. And some of these kids stayed put. And then there was, because the Balachari example became such a good political model, it kind of just gave that little, what should I say, very good option to the British, because at that time, let's not forget that USSR was a very important wartime ally. So here they could, by following this example of putting the Polish people in territories which were not in direct control of the British, of UK, they were not knowing their much needed ally USSR, and yet able to extend some succor to Polish allies. So this model of sending people into areas which were subservient to the British, it's been replicated. So the camp at Kolhapur is an example of that. That got set up in the same model because Kolhapur was also a princely state. And they also did the same thing in Nyasaland, British Nyasaland, which is present-day Tanzania and part of Uganda. I think they had some sort of I'm not 100% sure, but they had some sort of an arrangement over there. And also that explains why Polish citizenry landed up in Mexico. So they're not exactly in USA, but they're close to USA in Mexico. So it's all a spin-off of the Balachari model. So getting back to your question, yes, there was a transit camp in Karachi, and then there was another camp for adults, which was the truncated family, men of over military age and women and truncated families and some children with a single parent at Kolhapur, which was also a princely state. But there, the grip of the British was far stronger. It was ruled by a regency council. So the British had a much stronger say in Kolhapur. So, yeah.
So, who were Kira Vanasinska and Wanda Dinovska? Yeah, and how did they help the Polish refugees?
So one more place for the Polish was also Bombay, and present-day Mumbai. The Polish consulate was in Bombay. That's the first thing. So they set up certain facilities. Now this entire scheme, Kira Banashinska, now coming to Kira Banashinska, she was the wife of the first Polish Consul General to India, Dr. Eugene Banashinsky. And she became the delegate of the Polish Red Cross as soon as the war broke out. And she's kind of the face of this entire piece of history. Actually, if one had to put a face to it, it should actually be Kira Banashinska, because she got everybody involved, the moment the news came in, so all, tying up the loose ends. It was, in fact, almost her brainchild that We are sending lorries with the Red Cross lorries with some comforts to Soviet Union. So why can't they bring the children out? Which is actually how the children reached India. They came by an overland route. There's a huge misconception going on in India, or it went on for a pretty long time. And I drew a flag, I'm going aside over here. I drew a lot of flag from senior Chrissy Siberia groups, who said, why do they say we went by ship? Because somebody had somehow started this story of they went by ship. And no names here, but I used to get a lot of flag. And I said
that's what all of us historians get. We'll put something out there and say something specific, and then everyone's like, no, you're wrong. However, but you're like, but I've got the evidence. It's right in front. This is what it is. I feel your pain.
And you're the last person who should be blamed for these strange, twisted stories about boatloads that are circulating at the moment, and sadly they are still circulating.
Tim, I've actually gotten down to the bottom of it, and I really, it won't be very polite of me to say. It was just a certain amount of confusion that the royal family initially had, and we didn't have much knowledge of these historic episodes, because as Indians, we got so caught up with our independence. So I think, it was the royal family and who probably put out these stories, and they would get carried by the media. And here I was holding up the evidence and say no, they came by an overland route. Everybody remembers an overland route, except once, a small short boat ride, from Quetta to wherever, to Jamnagar. But those stories have not gone. And I sometimes get the flag. Of course, I've held up my peace placard hundreds of times to senior members of Chrissy Siberia. I said, please read my thesis. Please read my book. Please, this is the map I put out. I have never ever ascribed to the book story. Kira worked very closely with Captain A.W.T. Webb, Archibald W.T. Webb, and got these camps up and functioning. And I have not answered your question about Wanda Dinovska. She was a theosophist who was already present in India prior to World War II, and then she joined forces with Kira and was helping with the Red Cross activities. She ran the Indo-Polish Society library. She wrote books when the various books were in short supply. She had a very good relationship with Mahatma Gandhi, and she kept him appraised of the Polish situation. And both Kira and Wanda remained in India afterwards. Kira and her husband went to UK for a short while. They came back. Wanda remained. She is mentioned. She later on worked with Tibetan refugees, and she is mentioned in some of Dalai Lama's memoirs of that period.
Oh, wonderful. I was not aware of that connection with Tibet. That's absolutely wonderful.
Kira and her husband, they went to, once they went to the UK, and then they lost the diplomatic status. Just didn't feel very comfortable. And they came back to India in 1946 or something. Or pardon me if I got the year 1 or 2 years wrong, 1946 or 47. They came back to Mumbai because that's what she writes in her biography, that we had friends in India. And they stayed put in India. They embraced Indian citizenship in 1964. They both have died in India, and they rest at the Mahalakshmi Cemetery in Mumbai. And Kira had been an Indian citizen for over 35 years when she was decorated with the Polonia Restituta in 2000 or 2001, when the new government came in Poland. I mean, one of the first things they did is they came and they honored her.
I need to say that I know very little about these two women. I've never even heard their names before till today, really. And I think they deserve so much more for what they did.
Possibly. I think yes, because, it's very gracious of the Polish government and the Polish people who've started recognizing this piece of history. There's a school in the name of Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji, and there's a town square in, I think they call it the Dobry Maharadza Square in Warsaw. I haven't seen that one yet. So because again, Maharaja Digvijay Singh Ji, Ranjit Singh Ji, was too long and mouthful of a name. So I think they've shortened it. But I think possibly. I guess it's up to the people to do what they think right. But they did play a very important role.
So then let's go back. Obviously, I asked the question a little bit early. So let's go back to that question that I asked a little bit early. So talking us through this journey that the children had, what did they face? And where did they end up?
Oh, these children, they really, braved a hair-raising journey. Absolutely. My God. I think those parts are still quite wild to this date. First of all, we have read reports that they were, braving all sorts of conditions when some of them landed up at the orphanages or the collection centers that were organized by General Anders in USSR. So there are reports of, parents leaving their children at the orphanages that, that they might have a better chance at survival. I mean, they're very, very heartbreaking stories, believe me. I mean, during my research period, I spent a lot of time, almost in tears reading these accounts. So there was this orphanage at Ashgabat, which the Stalin actually penciled in when the evacuation was allowed. He penciled in this route, Ashgabat to Mashhad, over the mountains. So these kids, they came across that, and one of the reports is of a little boy, I think a 6-year-old or a 8-year-old maybe, I think it's 6-year-old, who carried his 2-year-old sister, 18 months old sister on his back and walked miles to reach these collection centers. These are like, oh my. Alina, these are heartbreaking stories, honestly.
I mean, anyway. Listening to a young boy carrying his baby sister for miles, I mean, it is heartbreaking. I can't imagine how many more stories you've got up your sleeves that would make our listeners cry. And me, and Tim, probably.
Yeah.
Actually, these are some of them which I read at the collections, at the archival collections. I mean, I guess this must have been absolutely a tearjerker that the officer wrote it, in his very stern military report. He actually mentioned the story of a 6-year-old carrying his 18-month-old sister on his back for miles and reaching the collection center. But, overall, when I used to hear the members, yes, they were very, very difficult stories. Okay, now, emotions aside. So they crossed over to Mashhad. The British had given a visa. There was the invitation for 500 children, but there were rules that they had to be quarantined, and only when those who were not ill, they could make the very arduous overland journey to India. So, as I mentioned to you a little earlier, these Polish Red Cross lorries were going, and it was Kira's brainchild. And she said, if we are going to be sending these lorries, why should they all the way up to, border of Russia, USSR? Why should they come back empty? They should bring the kids on the return route. And everybody thought it was a very, very precarious and a dangerous idea. So the Deputy Consul General, Dr. Tadeusz Leszewski, I'm sorry if I've not got it. It's pronounced as Lisescki. I hope I've got the Leszewski.
Leszewski, don't worry about it. Nobody minds. I'm not going to sit there and nitpick.
Okay. So Dr. Tadeusz Leszewski, he traveled along with the convoy. And in the convoy from Mashhad, and there was this lady Hanka Ordonovna, who was an actress, I think, of pre-war of repute in pre-war Poland. And there was also this gentleman called Henryk Hadala, I think a junior minister. So they traveled in this convoy of children, and they traveled down this road which was being built under the Lend-Lease scheme from Bandar Abbas up. So they traveled on the section from Zahedan, Birjand, Shusp sector in late March. And so there is memory of them celebrating Easter at, on en route with the back of the truck serving as an altar. So they just made the back of the truck and the altar, and all the children stood below and someone offered some prayers. I think it's like almost, if we are looking at Easter next weekend, we are looking at the story exactly 80 years ago, almost to the date. The detail is there. I mean, the diarist Frank Herzog, whose diary forms a part of the second homeland, he's written a bit about it. He had this memory. So on 2nd of April 1942, they crossed over to Indian territory at a place called Nokundi, which is now in Pakistan. It was undivided India at that time. And then they drove across, reached Quetta military station, where the group of children was met by Madame Kira Banashinska and Captain A.W.T. Webb. So they rested for some days. I mean, they offered a proper Thanksgiving Mass. And then they went further to Delhi, and where they met some of the British officials. And at one of the receptions, they sang the British anthem, God Save the King, and with their very heavy Polish accents, a lot of children, former children of Bhattacharjee, remember that it sounded more like God Save the King.
Forgive me.
No, it's one of the lighter parts in this rather heavy story at times. So, forgive me too. But at least, at least it's something that brings you cheer,
Yeah.
Then they took the train and they reached Bombay, present-day Mumbai, where Kira had rented 2 bungalows, huge bungalows, and, boys and girls. And they rested there. And they had been through a lot physically. So the children, they went through, they were given... People, the diarist, Mr. Frank Herzog, late Mr. Frank Herzog, he waxes eloquent about getting a clean bed with an orange over it. I mean, it meant so much to those children who had been through so much in the earlier years. I mean, just a clean bed, a fresh set of clothes, and or 2 fresh sets of clothes, and a clean bed entirely to themselves with an orange kept on it. I mean, the children were absolutely delighted, over the moon. I mean, just imagine something so simple as that meant almost the world to them. So they rested there for a couple of months. The children had health problems, so they went through medical checks. So those who were found to be with tuberculosis were sent to sanatoriums. Dental issues, septic tonsils, etc., all that health issues that a lot of growing up children, and they had been starved, so they had, all kinds of problems. So 6 months they just rested in Bombay, and the camp in Bhattacharjee was still under construction at that time. So the royal family was kind of looking into it. Maharaja Jam Sahib, Digvijay Singh Ji, he had given the use of Bhattacharjee, which was his summer residence. The grounds of the summer residence he handed over for the setting up of the camp, and it was constructed there. And once it was in July, I think, yes, it was sometimes in mid-July that the camp moved from Mumbai to Bhattacharjee once it was completed, and there he was to greet the children along with the royal family. And it seems he said that, okay, welcome to Navanagar, and you are no longer orphans, but Navanagaris, and I am Bapu, which is father to all Navanagaris, including you. And this statement, I believe, had a very, very, I understand, had a very deep emotive effect on these children who had lost their parents, and they had been through so much struggle, because a lot of people reported it.
Sticking with the subject, we've heard about this wonderful statement that he made, that more than a few have reported hearing, that you're no longer orphans. Did the royals continue to play a role after the welcoming, as life in the camp continued?
Absolutely. Allow me to come to that. So, in the camp, they converted one of the barracks was, of course, converted into the hospital. Another was converted into the chapel, and they needed doctors because they found some nursing staff. So Maharaja, he was regularly he needed to know what was happening. So he appointed the wife of his ADC. His ADC was Major Geoffrey Clark, and he appointed his wife, Mrs. Catherine Clark, as the liaison officer. So anything at all that the children needed, the camp administration needed, it was conveyed to him. So the first request that he received was that the children, there is no place for a school. So it's very important, the children have not been to school for such a long time. So immediately one of the royal buildings, which was not in use in Bhattacharjee, was promptly given to the camp to be used as a school. And there's a very, very lovely picture of the children and all the children sitting in front of the school building. And I wish I could share those pictures with you. And thereafter, the camp administration took over all these its activities. So church was in place, school was in place. Next was scouting. So Lieutenant Peshkovsky was a very important visitor and to the school, to the camp as scoutmaster. So Maharaja, and then as the cultural activities started, they started picking up the cultural activities. The Maharaja's family, they would attend some of the cultural activities in the camp, and children were often invited to the palace. So another thing that happened was when the hot summer came, they needed a place to swim because they were very close to the sea, and which was not safe for the children to go. So he gave the use of his personal pool, which was adjacent to the palace, for the children to use. And it continued like this. There's a lot of interaction. There are very, very happy pictures of, the children and Maharaja, various cultural events, etc. But the most important thing that happened, which came a little later, of course, was towards 1944, I think, I think it was 1944. When the new government came into Poland, or a little after, at the end of the war, they were designated. All these children were designated as wards of the state. So they were to be repatriated back to Poland, and there was a lot of ferment. The children didn't want to, because of the experiences that they had had in Soviet Russia, and it was of the new government in Poland. They were not very trusting of that.
So the bottom line is that the British refused to acknowledge the Polish government in exile, but however did acknowledge the current Lublin government. So then the Polish children had to be sent back.
Yeah. So now, wait a minute. Let me yes, that is the bottom line. Correct. So that's where, again, Maharaja Jam Saheb plays a role, which is that, the camp commander, Captain Pluta, he made this urgent request that, these kids cannot go back to the Lublin government country. So this cannot happen. So what do you do? So then, they came up with an idea that they formed an adoption council, which was headed by the Maharaja, Colonel Geoffrey Clark, and Captain Pluta. So they formed this adoption council. Captain Pluta is responsible for their moral well-being. So he arranges with the convents in the US. The Orchard Lake Seminary accepts the idea of taking on 34 boys, and the St. Bernardine Sisters of Pennsylvania, they accept the idea of taking 50 girls into their mission centers. So this adoption council, what they do is, so Lieutenant Colonel Major Jeffrey Clark, later Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Clark, he liaises with the British and he organizes travel permits for these kids. So Captain Pluta has organized for these children to go to the USA. So Colonel Jeffrey Clark, he liaises with the British, and Maharaja Jam Sahib defrays the costs for their travel to the US. And so that's how I think 84 children from Bhattacharjee camp reached the USA to these Polish seminary organizations there. And then the remaining were then transferred to the Kolhapur camp.
So do we know what happened to many of them after the war? Do we have any accounts of their lives after India?
I'm not sure if this is a good platform to say, but because of the lack of funds, to follow up on these 84 children who went to the USA. So I really don't know. But I did meet some of the children who reached Poland. Some of them are still there. They're alive. And they're very warm. They received me very warmly. And they said life was very different under the communist government. It was different. But anyway, the best part is that they kept the memory alive, and they came back and they installed a memorial plaque in Bhattacharjee as soon as it was permissible by the governments. And there were a lot of people who reached UK. So I could meet some of them, and they received me very warmly. A lot of them got education under the schemes that the Polish government had put together in the UK. And then there are people who reached Australia. This story is a little difficult again. After the camp and then of course there were some people who reached Israel, Eretz Israel at that time, because there were Jewish children in the camps in India. So we a very small number of them. We could find 6 of them, and they're dealt with in the book, their story. So they were moved to Israel under the auspices of the Joint Distribution Authority, JDA. So everybody had a very different life trajectory in the different countries that they called home after India, which accepted them. It was not, but what is common throughout is that everybody across the board remembered India as a very happy place. The title comes from some statements that some of the survivors made to me, that India was home to us. It was the only place where we were children again after Poland. So it was the second homeland.
I love this story, but before we round off, I know Tim's got something he wants to tell us. Go for it, Tim.
I had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman, Carol, who was one of the Maharaja's children, and he now runs a vineyard and a bed and breakfast in Australia. And he absolutely loved the Maharaja, and he went back, and they're still in touch with the Maharaja's descendants. And the Maharaja's descendant, I don't know if it was his son or grandson, dropped everything to come and meet Carol and his family, to show them round. And this lovely bond is still carrying on to this day.
I've got to tell you, there is a reason I've always wanted to go to India, and now it has strengthened this need to go there about 100 times. So COVID, please go away so I can go and visit India and see some of these places, if they still exist, hopefully. Do they still exist?
Yes, very much, but not exactly in the way the Polish people had left them. Actually, yes, when I was researching, I had the honor of meeting a survivor, Mr. Stefan. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not Klosowski. Stefan Klosowski. He came from Canada, and he had retired as an engineer from Pratt& Whitney. And so one of the things that he did as soon as he kind of retired was to come and pay quote unquote homage to India, because he said, so that's where I caught up with him when I was researching. And we have this very lovely pictures of three of us, and we went visiting Maharaja, who very kindly, the son of the former Maharaja, very pleasantly took us around his estate, etc., etc. And yes, now they were actually very confused, because I remember I sat in that conversation with them, and Maharaja, the junior Maharaja, was very surprised that these people were not Jewish, because they always thought that the children who came were Jewish. That actually led to the first research paper on this topic by Dr. Kenneth Robbins, because he had been told pretty almost authentically by the royal family that, we had a whole lot of Jewish kids stay in Navanagar, So he went around researching, and he said there was a chapel there. So Dr. Ken Robbins' paper is actually the first academic work on the subject from which I could take over. So a lot of misunderstanding is definitely there, but yes, everybody remembers it very well, and it's actually a very, very nice story. I'm sorry, I'm coming back to your question, Alina. Yes, those places are there, pretty much exactly in the same use that was done. That is, the camp is now a military school and houses about the same number of children, 650 children. It's the Sainik School of Balachari. And Dr. Ken gave a whole lot of papers, and then later on, even I followed his footsteps to tell the school of its very historic, its beautiful history. So that is there. It's a restricted area. It's a military school, so you cannot really go there, but you can visit it from morning to dawn to dusk. That is what they have allowed. And the camp at Kolhapur housed the Hindu population that came out of Pakistan at the time of India's independence, the victims of the partition, which is in certain ways pretty comparable to the Holocaust, or in some ways at least, because that is the partition of the Indian subcontinent is the Holocaust of the of this part of the world. It's left a lot of people very, very, very deeply scarred. So the lot of refugees who came out from the partition were housed at the Kolhapur camp. And of course, it is now called Gandhinagar. They keep promising to keep it as clean as the Poles did. Well, we are hoping. Some of the old structures are still there. Some of the government structures are still there. Some are absolutely breaking apart, because as per the reports that I had read, they were just made of cheap material to just last a couple of years. Temporary abode is what was created in that area by the Hindustan Construction Company. And they have lasted. I mean, I wish I could show you pictures. There are still some of the school is still the school. There is that bit of the matting is still there. During one of the reunions, I remember I was there, and some of the survivors were there, and they were like shedding copious tears, touching that matting and remembering, all that days. And somebody was like delighted as children because they met the old milkman who used to let them have milk for free. They were like children. I mean, the river Panchgani, where they had a bath, they would go jumping, diving. So, or go to Panchgani, where they would go climbing, scouting. And the stories of Shivaji that they had been told over there, the Indian military hero of that part of the country. But what I saw as a neutral observer, everywhere, whether in Poland or in UK or in India, there's like a lot of good memories associated with their stay in India, which is, I would say, very, very nice, because they had a hard life before, and they had they had to grow up, take responsibility for themselves, after leaving India. So it couldn't have been, all sunny.
Anuradha, thank you so much. That was absolutely enlightening. Before we finish, can you just remind our listeners the name of your book?
It's called The Second Homeland, the Polish refugees in India. If there was something I could do, I would change that Polish refugees to Polish exiles. I apologize, but I was young and stupid at that time when I chose that book.
That's okay. You are forgiven. From the whole Polish nation, I forgive you right now.
Thank you so much.
But honestly, I'm so fascinated. I want to know more. I desperately now want to go to India, and I want to know more about the Indian royal family. That sparked an interest for me now as well. So thank you for sending me down that rabbit hole. And Tim, thank you so much for joining us and being a co-host today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you both.